Good morning. We are the Andes research team invited by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We aim to provide a country profile for Australian firms which are considering international expansion. Our group has chosen New Zealand, a close neighbor but also a unique business environment. I'm Yiling. In my part, I will examine how globalization has influenced New Zealand's political and economic systems. Next, I will highlight the legal challenges that Australian firms may face when entering this market. And then, Feifei and Jiamei will talk about the two indicators and culture of New Zealand. Let me begin with the political system. New Zealand is a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary democracy. Citizens enjoy strong rights such as freedom of speech and the right to vote, while Parliament holds the executive accountable. This creates transparency and stability, which are highly attractive to foreign investors. Globalization has a direct impact here. As trade and capital flows increase, the governments must balance domestic interest with global competitiveness. For example, New Zealand has to adapt the policy in areas like environmental regulation to satisfy both local communities and international investors. However, scholars also warn that the political stability may sometimes make New Zealand more vulnerable to external pressures, especially from larger trading partners. This illustrates the tension globalization creates in a small democracy. In terms of the economic system, New Zealand operates as a market economy, essentially capitalist. Since the 1980s, its liberalized trade, reduced protectionism, and integrate deeply into global market. A milestone was in 2008, when it became the first OECD country to sign a free trade agreement with China. More recently, a Reuters report in 2025 noted that the government relaxed the foreign investment rules, even allowing some overseas investors to buy housings. This showed their strategy of openness. However, globalization also brings risks. The Treasury highlights vulnerabilities such as reliance on global commodity prices and foreign capital inflows. On the positive side, globalization connects New Zealand's firm with international research network, compensating for its more democratic market and fostering innovation. Finally, the legal system. New Zealand follows common law with two main branches, criminal and civil, which made it distinctive is the integration of Maori rights under the Treaty of Waitangi, which safeguard local culture and resources. For Australian companies, three legal challenges are critical. First, compliance with Maori law and cultural expectation. Using Maori symbols, land, or their language without respect can breach the New Zealand's law. Second, foreign investment reviews. New Zealand screens investments in sensitive sectors such as telecommunications and critical infrastructures. Therefore, Australian firms who want to enter this area may face more difficulties. Third, high compliance costs. Firms must meet strict environmental standards and IP protections, which could increase entry costs. Compared with Australia, New Zealand emphasis on cultural and environmental safeguard is even stronger, meaning firms must show both profitability and social responsibility in the long terms in order to make achievement in New Zealand. In summary, globalization has made New Zealand's political economic more open and attractive to foreign investors, while also exposing it to external pressures and regulatory complexity. Recognizing both the opportunities and challenges will be essential for Australian firms entering this market.
Thanks, Yiling. I'm going to talk about the economic and human development indicators in New Zealand and shows how these two indicators affect Australian firms' entry into the New Zealand market. New Zealand's Human Development Index was 0.938 in 2023, ranked 70th globally, slightly decreased from 0.939 in 2022. This value places it in the very high category for human development, which means New Zealand has achieved remarkable success in national health, education, and income levels. For the most obvious life expectancy, New Zealand life expectancy for 2025 is 83.1, a 0.18% increase from 2024. Canada, which belongs to the same Anglo category as New Zealand, has a life expectancy for 83.26. Australia is 84.18. This data can illustrate that New Zealand sits near the upper tier of Anglo countries, still has room for incremental improvement. For economics, we focus on gross national income and purchase power parity. The data shows the GNI for 2024 was approximately 401.25 billion New Zealand dollars, a 5.43% increase from 2023. PPP for 2024 was 53,116 US dollars, and for 2023 was 52,000. So these two sets of data suggest a stable and expanding economy and greater market opportunities, makes New Zealand become more attractive to foreign investment and cross-border expansion. Multinationals face different economy, political, cultural, and legal institutional backgrounds in different countries or industries. As a member of Andes, we suggest that both economic indicators and human development indicators are important and should be given priority consideration in different industries. In the cross-border operation of enterprises, they usually choose to carry out their cross-border business in countries with higher HDI. For example, the healthcare or tourism business of Australia. In this case, I believe that human development plays a significant role. More complete infrastructure and a workforce related to tourism and a higher level of education can provide better services. In addition, a higher HDI suggests a safe, stable, and healthy environment, which is very attractive to tourists. The increasing life expectancy also makes New Zealand an attractive market for healthcare multinationals, for example, elderly care, medical devices, and medicines. From the other point of view, experience of international business, the host country's assets and resources are all critical factors influencing decisions in international business. And also, the multinationals take the economic scale of a nation as a significant indicator for their business location. If we set out on the digital services industry, the process of it requires a large amount of investment. According to the data we mentioned earlier, both GNI and PPP in New Zealand have increased, which provide a stable market foundation for digital services. The enhancement of purchase power will drive up the demand for high-value digital products and services. A healthy and stable economic environment can enable multinational enterprises to obtain more favorable financing conditions. In summary, when multinationals plan to enter foreign markets, both economic indicators and human development indicators are essential. The decision to conduct cross-border business is important and complex. It's always the result of multiple factors influencing and interacting with each other. The final part about culture will be handed over to Jiamei.
Thanks, Feifei. Hello, everyone. I'm Jiamei Wong. Now, let me introduce the cultural distance between New Zealand and Australia. First, I would like to introduce the theory of Hofstede's cultural dimensions. According to the graph, New Zealand and Australia show quite similar patterns across the 6 dimensions. For power distance, both countries score low, meaning the psychological gap between supervisors and employees is small. This reduces the communication distance for Australian businesses operating in New Zealand. Next, both New Zealand and Australia are highly individualist. This means that both New Zealand and Australia place greater emphasis on individual goals over collective goals. However, New Zealand nowadays places high emphasis on moral collectivism. Therefore, Australian firms should integrate collective values into business practices. In terms of masculinity and femininity, both New Zealand and Australia tend to have motivation towards achievement and success. However, firms must also account for cooperation and work-life balance, which are increasingly important in New Zealand society. For uncertainty avoidance, both are comfortable with ambiguity and flexible toward change, meaning Australian firms face fewer barriers when entering New Zealand market. Therefore, tolerance for uncertainty reduces the risk of cultural friction in business processes. For long-term and short-term orientation, both New Zealand and Australia have a moderate attitude to maintain time-honored traditions and norms. Both Australian and New Zealand firms are comfortable making strategic plans and long-term contracts, but they don't put the future ahead of present needs. For indulgence and restraint dimension, both New Zealand and Australia highly value leisure, lifestyle, and personal freedom, which means they don't have as strict social norms as other cultures. Overall, Hofstede's framework suggests low cultural distance between New Zealand and Australia. However, cultural distance is dynamic, not static. Even though Australia and New Zealand are broadly similar, subtle differences, such as the growing influence of moral collectivism, are increasingly visible. Second, I would like to introduce another famous framework called Ronan and Schenker's cultural clusters. This framework groups countries with similar cultures, and both New Zealand and Australia fall within the Anglo cluster, reflecting shared language, history, institutions, and geographical proximity. In conclusion, Australia and New Zealand share deep cultural similarities based on two frameworks. These similarities create a relatively low baseline of cultural distance, making Australia business expansion less complex than entry into more distant cultural environments. However, although the cluster still holds, intra-cluster variation is growing. For New Zealand and Australia, this means they still have shared foundations, but slight differences are emerging, particularly around values linked to social equity and inclusivity. Evidence highlights that even small cultural gaps can materially influence international ventures if not actively managed. Taken together, these insights indicate that although the two nations remain culturally close, their values may gradually become more disparate. For Australian firms, recognizing these emerging differences and adopting bridging strategies that align with local expectations can mostly mitigate against the transaction cost arising from the cultural distance with New Zealand. All in all, our teams can see that New Zealand offers both opportunities and challenges for Australian firms. Globalization has shaped its political and economic systems, creating openness, stability, but also external pressures. Its legal and cultural framework, with strong moral and environmental safeguards, requires respect and compliance. Altogether, this means firms must align with economic and human development to succeed. In short, New Zealand is an attractive market for Australian firms. Recognizing these dynamics can build a foundation for sustainable and long-term success in the neighboring economy. Thank you for listening, and this is our reference list.